People always say betrayal starts with a feeling, a hunch, a gut instinct, something primal that whispers something's wrong. I used to laugh at that. I believed in proof, in logic, in paper trails. But the day my business partner disappeared, I learned the hard way that instincts aren't superstition, they're survival. My name is Daniel Mercer, 39 years old, co-founder of Mercer and Hale Consulting, one of the fastest growing private analytics firms in Boston. For years, we built our empire together, me, the numbers guy, and Ryan Hale, the charmer. I handled the data, he handled the clients. I was the quiet one. He was the one everyone liked. And maybe that was my first mistake, thinking charisma meant honesty. On a gray Tuesday morning, Ryan vanished, no warning, no message, just gone. His phone off, his apartment cleaned out, and a notice from the bank freezing every account with our company's name on it. At first, I thought he'd been kidnapped. I called the police, filed a missing persons report, even contacted his family. But within 48 hours, the truth hit me like a train. He wasn't missing. He had run dot, and he'd taken everything, nearly $8 million siphoned from our corporate reserves, routed through offshore accounts, buried under fake invoices, disguised with my own digital signature. It was perfect, elegant, even. The kind of fraud I'd have admired if it hadn't destroyed my life. By Friday, I was a suspect. The FBI showed up at my office, asking questions I didn't have answers for. My name was on every transfer, every approval form. I was suspended, then fired. My bank accounts were locked. My reputation, the one thing I'd spent my life protecting, was in flames. And while I was watching my career collapse in real time, the man who did it was sending me messages. The first one came through a private encrypted email. A single sentence: "You should have watched the numbers closer, Danny." That's when I realized Ryan hadn't just stolen the money. He'd planned this for months, maybe years. Every step was deliberate. Fake clients, shell companies, staged invoices, forged timestamps. I'd helped him build the entire infrastructure, unknowingly. And Claire, God, I should have seen that part coming. My wife had always been distant, but I chalked it up to the late nights, the stress, the travel. She worked in PR, polished, confident, with a way of looking at people like she already knew how they'd betray her. When I found out she'd been helping Ryan with the firm's media strategy, it didn't bother me. He was my best friend. I trusted him, until the night I came home and saw her phone buzzing on the counter. A message preview, half visible: "Same hotel tomorrow, room 802. And underneath it, a name I didn't want to believe: Ryan. I stood there in silence, the sound of the refrigerator humming behind me, staring at the screen until the letters blurred. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. That night she came home late, smelling of wine and hotel soap. She smiled like nothing had happened, kissed me goodnight, and fell asleep next to me. I didn't confront her. Not yet, because something had shifted inside me, something cold and deliberate. I realized I couldn't just react. I had to calculate. This wasn't about catching them in bed or screaming about betrayal. This was about dismantling their world, the way they'd dismantled mine, quietly, surgically, and without a trace. But first I needed proof, real, indisputable evidence that would burn them both to the ground. So I started where I always start, with data. While Claire slept, I sat in my office, combing through Ryan's old encrypted drives. I knew his habits, his favorite aliases, his password patterns, his secret folder names that pretended to be corporate backups. He was brilliant, yes, but he was predictable. At 3:17 a.m., I found what I was looking for: a folder labeled /ghost ledger/ buried under an archive of fake client reports. Inside were hundreds of encrypted PDFs, hidden messages and recordings, transactions, voice memos, and one video file. The timestamp: the night before Ryan disappeared. I remember opening it with my breath caught in my throat. The screen flickered. Grainy security footage from what looked like a hotel room. Claire, Ryan sitting close whispering, then kissing, laughing, talking about me. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't throw the laptop against the wall like some movie cliché. I just watched. And I memorized every word. Because now I finally understood what they'd done and what I was going to do in return. Ryan Hale thought he could vanish. He thought he'd buried me alive, but he forgot one thing: I built this company. And I built him too. And I know how to erase a man better than anyone. When betrayal arrives with a spreadsheet attached, you learn to answer it in the only language it understands: method. I didn't have the luxury of fury. Fury makes noise. Noise gets you arrested, or worse, it signals the people who build their lives in silence. I needed precision. I needed to be invisible and inevitable at once. First, containment. If Ryan had forged my signature across those transfers, then the first objective was to show I hadn't authorized them. The FBI was already sniffing around the office, polite in the way predators are polite before they bite. I called my lawyer quietly, through an encrypted line I'd used in another life, and asked him to file an affidavit asserting that my credentials had been compromised. The goal was twofold: create a legal breadcrumb that separated me from the money on paper, and buy time while I probed beneath the surface. Buying time was a miracle in itself. With my accounts frozen and my firm's reputation eroding, time was the only currency that still mattered, while the affidavits did the bureaucratic work. I did what I always did when someone else's numbers betrayed me. I followed the trail backward from the money. I had access to the old server archives Ryan kept for client briefs. He'd been sloppy with naming conventions, comforting for me, deadly for him. In the Ghost Ledger folder there were transfer memos with the same odd note attached: project stabilization, client discretion. Project stabilization is clean language for hush money. Discretion means someone paid handsomely. The transfers touched Singapore, then a shell in the Isle of Man, then an intermediary in Delaware. Not unusual. The unusual part was a single IP address that pinged the ledger at times when I knew Ryan would be with clients. That IP resolved to a small data room service in Boston, one we used occasionally for sensitive proposals. I set up a small trap. I created a fake proposal, a thin, glossy PDF about a municipal analytics contract, and seeded it in the room with a gratuitous line of code that would phone home if the file was opened outside of all authorized machines. I made it look like negligence, a password written to a sticky note. The trap was crude, and that was the point. People who run from daylight don't look for clumsy things. They look for clean ones. The trap would tell me who touched what, and from where. Within 48 hours, someone touched it. Not Ryan. At that time he was missing, in the way he wanted to be. The file pinged from a boutique firm in Back Bay that handled escrow for shell corporations. The account manager there had a small webcam habit. His home footage, nothing eloquent, just motion and a darkened living room, showed a pair of hands and the flash of a screen. I clicked a frame, enhanced it. There on the background shelf, a logo of a legal practice I'd seen in Ryan's Ghost Ledger. Names converge, and when names converge with movement, they become a map. Maps require people to read them. I rang Rena. She was the one who'd once put my suspension on hold during an audit because she'd liked me long enough to do the right thing. She met me at a diner and, across the clink of cups, I told her what I'd found. She went pale like someone whose numbers had become confessions. I can pull their counsel's findings, he said, but they'll bury it in documents. You want clarity? Call Marcus. No, not Marcus. Call Jonah at the escrow firm. He's sloppy and anxious. He'll be the one who makes a mistake. We needed Jonah's mistake, so we made one for him. Marco, my friend from old ops who still loved the challenge more than money, called him under the guise of a legal auditor looking for an invoice trail. Jonah, eager to look cooperative, forwarded a set of files. Hidden in them was metadata that revealed the real beneficiary of the Isle of Man company. A name popped up. Avery Consulting. Avery's director's name was a man called G. Mercer. Coincidence, perhaps, except that the date stamps matched the nights Ryan and Claire had met. The map sharpened, and then it cut. At home, Claire kept her face smooth. People acting guilty act the other way. They perform normalcy like armor. I behaved the same. I let the house be. But I recorded everything. I put a small audio logger in the living room under the guise of a smoke alarm replacement I'd installed the month before. People who cheat have patterns. A cigarette in the bathroom, a call on the walk, a voice that softens in a particular rhythm. Patterns are proof when you can corroborate them with bank entries and travel logs. Evidence without leverage is a fearful thing. Leverage turns proof into movement. I needed leverage that would not be easily discredited and would force Ryan to reveal himself or make the men protecting him make mistakes. So I chose a shape of leverage that men with money ate: reputation. Not the kind they thought they had: smooth, legal, philanthropic, but the fragile, visible kind: trustees, donors, plaques on museum walls. I drafted a dossier built not to indict in court, but to make rooms uncomfortable. I curated it with the same care I'd used to build pitches in the early days: crane headers, crisp gates, documented transfers, and a small pile of images, hotel receipts, timestamp surveillance frames, and, the most dangerous thing of all, Claire's discreet messages to Ryan that I'd captured from the ghost ledger. I sent it anonymously to a trustee I had once met at a fundraiser and who was known for a near-superstitious fear of scandal. The packet landed like a cold hand on his conscience. Men who acquire property in reputations respond fast. They reacted by calling in favors and asking their counsel for audits. Audits take time, but they ripple. While the trustee trembled at the thought of a bad headline, I moved to tighten a different loop, the human one. I fed small, believable rumors into the firm's grapevine: rumors of an auditor who found discrepancies, of a junior partner who'd put things in a locker for safekeeping. I used my knowledge of internal politics to nudge a junior partner into panic. He was the sort who loved being the man with the answer, and that vanity is a solvent. He forwarded an encrypted thumb drive to a locker service for transfer to legal. That locker, silly in hindsight, had cameras. Cameras love men who think they're too clever to be watched. We watched. One night, Daniel the junior and a courier met at the locker. The courier's plates were turned into an alias, but Motorola footage caught the courier's arm tattoo. Tattoo matched to a fixer's man I'd watched at a charity gala 2 months earlier. Names stacked. The problem was not that I could expose everything in a single blow. The problem was that to expose one thing meant another hand would reach for damage control. When the board of trustees convened and the audit window opened, men began moving to protect themselves. Lawyers wrote letters. Counsel requested stays. The loom strained, but it didn't snap. It adjusted. That's when Ryan decided to play a different card. He reached out to me, not with threats, but with an offer I understood on sight: money for silence. His email read like a dare: "You can make everyone believe I ghosted you. Walk away and you'll keep what you have." He was already polishing the lie that painted him as the victim and me as the greedy partner who couldn't keep a secret. He thought he could buy a narrative. He underestimated two things: the arrogance that leaves traces, and the human networks that can sting back. I answered him with something colder. I told him I was contacting the regulators. I said I had a file one I would open only if he didn't come clean. Then I did something he didn't expect. I offered him a way out that would show everyone he hadn't vanished but had chosen to cooperate. It was a ruse. I wanted him to come out of hiding. Men who arrange escapes also arrange confessions. They do it with people they can trust. Ryan had no one left in the world he trusted more than me. He still believed that trait in me, so he called. And that call was my first real victory. We met in a parking garage because you never make big moves in traceable places. He walked in like a man who'd practiced the posture of innocence, but the posture cracks when you see the light. His face had paled. He carried a small leather folder and a phone with a broken screen. When he saw me, he smiled, that same easy smile that had unraveled me. "Danny," he said, "we can do this clean. Give me a cut. Walk away. You were always more theatrical than smart." I told him, "Why leave fingerprints on so many ledgers?" He laughed, the sound brittle. He started to speak in the old cadence, justifications, deflections. I let him. Then I showed him another thing from the ghost ledger, a video of him signing a transfer on his laptop with my own credentials cached in the browser. He inhaled, like a man who'd been dipped in cold water. "Why?" he asked, the single word raw and simple. "For the same reason you started," I said. "Because you believed you could shape the story. Because you thought your charm was armor." I slid a USB across the grimy concrete, not as a threat but as a barometer. "This is a backup. This goes to a trustee in 96 hours if you don't help me make a narrative that makes you look small and cooperative. You come to my terms, you live to be anonymous. You refuse, and the trustee wakes up and sees the videos." He flinched. He made the calculation. He was used to making options and probabilities. And then, to my near astonishment, he agreed. We set conditions. He would come clean to a federal investigator under the pretext of a plea bargain, but only if we could ensure certain protections for people not involved directly. He wanted his freedom. I wanted leverage and truth. We were both wolves bargaining over the same bone. That night, I walked home feeling like a man who had stolen his own life back with the neatness of a ledger entry. I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen watching coffee steam and thinking about the next moves. For one thing I was certain, this was no longer about money. It was about the inventory of people who'd been used, our staff, the clients who'd lost trust, the public projects that might collapse because of the scandal. If we were going to bring the house down, we had to prepare to rebuild. We'd bought a path forward. But the loom learns. Every time you force a hand, the loom shifts its weave. Our victory, if it could be called that, was only a halt, a pause. The people who run these systems have friends in courts and friends with quieter violence. We had made a visible cut. Now the work was to see what bled and how far the infection would spread. I sharpened the next blade: testimony, sealed affidavits, and a public narrative that would corrode the safe rooms of trustees. I set Danvers to work with a single, terrible brief: prepare a piece that would land with enough context to terrify the kinds of men who pay to keep things quiet, but not so much that the regulators would bury it in procedure before any human felt it. At dawn, after the meeting in the parking garage, Ryan left me with a look that was both apology and threat. He thought he'd negotiated his way back into anonymity. He didn't yet see the geometry of what I was doing, how every move tightened her on a center he didn't know existed. Revenge is not violence. It's geometry. You build angles, and you calculate load. You make people fall into places where their own weight finishes the job. I had a plan, and for the first time since his disappearance, I felt like a man who had the world's edges in his hands. The ledger was no longer only an instrument of loss. It had become a weapon. There's an old audit aphorism I've lived by. Numbers are arguments until someone adds context. Then they become proof. By the time I reached week 3, the ledger had become proof, and the city had become context. The thing I started with, a spreadsheet, a hidden folder, a video, had become a machine that forced people into rooms they used to hide behind. But machines weren't, and the one-eyed poke started to bite back. Ryan had agreed to meet under terms that smelled of strategy and desperation. He came out of hiding to speak to a federal agent under my orchestration, carefully scripted so his surrender could be framed as cooperation. That was the flimsy moral margin I'd kept to sleep at night. Get the money back, implicate the higher strings, protect the people who hadn't been complicit. It was a lie of convenience. The real truth was that I wanted a public, and making the kind that would leave men in suits with less swagger and fewer reputations to hide behind. He did what he'd promised in the worst way. He sang, not like a man with shame singing for absolution. He sang like a man scared of consequences. He named names the way people name children, fast, messy, and with a guilty instinct to minimize the damage. He implicated an escrow manager, a boutique law firm, and a string of trustees who allowed pressure to be bought and laundered under the code name stabilization. The agent, bored and efficient, took notes and scheduled follow-ups. I thought that would be enough to tip the scale. It wasn't. What it did was create a feedback loop. Once you force a few doors, the men behind the other doors talk to each other. Lawyers called. Private investigators were retained. A man with money and little conscience can summon 1,000 quiet hands. The loom contracted around the heat and recalculated. I learned that lesson the night someone broke into Jonah's office and left a dead bird on his desk with a note pinned to its breast. Silence is not bargaining. Jonah called me the next morning in a voice that had aged 10 years. His cooperation cooled. He'd been warned in a language that wasn't legal. The people above Marcus had people who could make intimidation feel ceremonial. That was the moment I realized our geometry required new angles. The old ones, legal threads, trustee panic, the threat of exposure, were useful, but insufficient. We needed pressure that couldn't be bought away with a PR firm or an NDA. We needed to make the cost of hiding the truth greater than the cost of letting it be known. And that meant turning their own languages against them. Law, reputation, community. I called Danvers and told him to prepare for a multi-wave piece. Not a single expose, I said. A slow burn series targeting the institutions, not the people. Let the institutions do the naming. He understood immediately. He was a journalist who'd learned early that a legal frame can do what a screaming headline cannot. He mapped sources, corroborations, and the exact times to drop each chunk so regulators and donors would be forced to act more than a single moment of scandal would achieve. We moved on to fronts at once. Marco and Rena continued to pry at paper and code. Every email log they could salvage, every timestamp anomaly, every cached login. My own hands shook as I watched lines of code and ledger entries bloom into a pattern that implicated more than an isolated embezzler. There was a larger architecture of facilitation law firms that filed shell company paperwork, custodial accounts that accepted microdonations and retransferred them, private charities that functioned as a clearinghouse for hush funds. The web had a torso now, not just legs. On the human side, I had to turn traders into messengers. The junior partner, called him Nate, was the vanity that had betrayed the firm. He'd been small and arrogant and had wanted to be important. When the locker footage surfaced and his face stared back at him, that vanity curdled into fear. I gave him something he couldn't refuse, the chance to speak first and get a plea deal rather than be paraded under subpoena. His testimony hurt. It named the logistics chain, the envelopes, the men with hands in the backrooms. In court, small witnesses with clear memories often do more damage than long, polished confessions from replaced executives. Nate's breathy accounts were the kind of human detail auditors bite onto. And still the loom adapted. Gideon disappeared from the obvious routes and reappeared where cameras were sparse and men's patience was long. Marcus hired counsel who could afford better silence. The law firm stacked motions, kept processes open, and turned our timeline into a procedural swamp. Regulators moved, but regulators operate at the pace of committees and calendars. The public seized for days. The law responded in months. I had to buy time for the law to catch up while simultaneously making the social and political price unbearable for those who paid for discretion. That soaked into the fabric of our small band in corrosive ways. Marco's sister's account freeze turned into a criminal inquiry. Rena's last message, "I can't keep looking over my shoulder," stayed in my text history like an accusation I hadn't yet fully accepted. Danvers got a cease and desist that read like a threat: retract or be sued for defamation. Claire's face in the hotel video became a carved-out thing. She left home twice under pretexts and came back with a quieter expression, like a person who'd learned to count her breaths. It was Claire who surprised me. Where I had expected pleas of protection or silence, she made a different move. She took the initiative and did something that hurt me more than any ledger entry. She walked into a donor meeting unannounced and quietly asked a question in a voice she used to save me from corporate idiocy. "Can you explain why this charity's funds were routed through an Isle of Man account last quarter?" It was a small, ordinary interrogative that landed like a stone in a still pond. The donor's face drained. He made an awkward laugh and offered platitudes. The seed had been planted. Claire had become someone I recognized again in that moment, not the woman caught on a grainy video, but the one who knew how to make public rooms uncomfortable with a single pointed question. I would have preferred no pain at all, but the work needed people willing to step up and be visible. She'd accepted a small, terrible price. We coordinated a sequence of releases: Danvers' multi-wave series, Nate's testimony, Jonah's counsel forced into disclosures, and a quiet regulatory subpoena based on an anonymized tip that carried the weight of 1,000 small, corroborated facts. It culminated in a trustee hearing convened by a foundation board that wanted transparency and, secretly, to save itself from further damage. The hearing was the sort of slow, terrible public ritual that eats reputations. Men who had never imagined needing a moral defense now had to provide one in front of cameras and donors and a public that smelled scandal like a tuna boat smells fish. The night before the hearing, I sat alone in my car and counted the ledger's turns. Each movement had a cost. Friends had been damaged. People had been scared. My marriage was a canvas of ash and grain. I felt less righteous than one. There's a nausea that comes from seeing consequences unfold. It isn't guilt exactly, but it's the knowledge that your hand, however justified, has touched people and changed them. The hearing opened with a thin, formal cadence. I watched it on a laptop in a diner, coffee gone cold. Danvers' first piece dropped at 10 o'clock a.m. a forensic primer. Nate testified at noon, voice trembling but precise. The trustees squirmed. Donors called. Counsel drafted a response. By mid-afternoon, the board convened emergency sessions, and the foundation announced an independent audit. That was the net beginning to pull, not a sudden collapse, but a reconfiguration. Men scrambled to protect what they could. And then something else happened, something that didn't appear on paper, but mattered more. In the hallway outside the hearing room, someone slipped a single photograph under my lawyer's office door. Claire and me in front of our house, a recent shot, glossy and intimate. On the back, a single handwritten line: "Stop or we will tell your children why their mother left." It was the kind of threat that sits below law. It is the language of men who still believe they own the weak places of your life. This was not about money anymore. This was one last lever. Make it personal, and you make people stop, because stopping is the cheapest way to keep your family safe. It would have worked on many. It almost worked on me. Almost. I folded the photograph into an envelope and sealed it. I sent a very different photograph back, not of my family, but of a ledger page with a string of names and a line item highlighted. Hololine beneficiary, Fairfax Charitable Trust. I mailed it anonymously to a trustee's private address with a note: You can decide to be honest. The move was petty. It was also a necessary escalation. If they were willing to play at our depths, I had to make the cost of silence visible and public in ways they feared, not just legal exposure but social and philanthropic annihilation. The hearing ended with no arrests. The regulators announced they were reviewing matters. Marcus publicly denied wrongdoing and hired more counsel. But the machine had been forced to reveal a scene. For now it leaked. For now donors blinked. For now trustees took calls and questioned the comfortable assumptions that had lubricated the network. Victory tasted like unfinished business, and the smell of it was copper on the tongue. At 2 a.m. I drove to the pier and watched the river move like a slow black belt. The ledger sat in my messenger back copies, backups, video stills. The tide was a slow, honest movement. It didn't rush or promise. I thought of Rena's last text, of Marco's phone number going dead for a day, of Danvers' tight voice. I thought of Claire's bravery and of how far a man could be willing to go before what he fights for becomes what he destroys. The scale had tilted a little, not enough to topple the loom, but enough to make it flinch, enough to make men rethink patterns and phone call habits, enough to buy us a few weeks of insecure peace. The problem was simple and classical. Someone else's patience was longer than mine, and their resources were deeper. The machine had adaptation. So did I, but adaptation at that level costs people you love. I slept badly and woke with that knowledge heavy at the base of my skull. The next stage would not be forensic leaks or trustee hearings. It would be about shaping public narratives so that judges, auditors, and donors all pointed their lights to the same place, to the heart of a network that had once thought itself untouchable. The ledger had become a weapon, and weapons sharpen quick. I kept sharpening. The thing about turning a ledger into a weapon is that it never feels like a single strike. It is 100 little cuts, each one precise, each one designed to draw attention away from the hand that holds the knife. By week 5, the machine had learned our edges. It stopped answering to headlines and began answering to discomfort, private phone calls, frozen pledges. Trustees who suddenly remembered every minor irregularity, as if they'd always planned to be outraged. That was the first kind of victory. Make the rooms where they hide feel uncomfortable enough that they move. What I hadn't counted on was how quickly discomfort becomes a personal thing. After the hearing, my nights were no longer about strategies. They were about maps of where people I loved could be touched. They learned to do damage in ways law couldn't fix and in places that felt intimate. An anonymous post on a neighborhood page accusing a volunteer program of mismanaging funds. A forged note sent to a client threatening to reveal their names. An envelope delivered to my mother's house with a photograph of me leaving a courthouse. It was psychological tax, small, cumulative, and corrosive. That is when the violence shifted from being remote to proximal. Not a smash and grab or a public beating. That would have drawn the kind of attention they could neither afford nor stomach. Instead, it was tactics that smelled like control. My car's tires slashed in daylight. Marcus's office vandalized with the sort of graffiti that only men who understand reputation can stitch into a smear. The junior partner's sister rested on a trumped-up charge and paraded through a booking desk for a press photo that said nothing in court but everything in a person's head. They wanted us to flinch. They wanted us to stop. We didn't stop. We changed. We stopped trying to win with just the public pen and learned to fight on private turf. We turned our playbook into something messier. Protect, misdirect, leverage. Where they hit family, we hit livelihood. Where they used legal tools, we used the public sphere to force trustees to answer to donors. Where they used men with ties in the night, we used light. I began with protection. Claire insisted she could leave, but we both knew it wasn't that simple. She would carry the past wherever she went. Instead, we fortified small things, safe routes to work, burner devices for quick communication, a discreet go bag in the trunk with copies of documents, and a change of clothes. Some yearbook safe houses for anyone who needed to disappear for a day or a week. Danvers made arrangements with an editor overseas to publish key pieces if anything happened to him. We made contingency plans like generals who'd learned the cost of being out of position. Then we made a choice that felt like moral landmines, but, in our calculus, were inevitable. We started to disrupt the machine's lines of comfort, the people who lubricated it in private and in public. There are people who live between the layers, the foundation managers, the trust accountants, the boutique counsel, who file the papers and never ask why. They are not monsters. They are professional enablers. We exposed one of them, a mid-level counsel at a firm in the city, a man who billed a lot and asked fewer questions, had been at the nexus for several signature chains. We didn't hack him or threaten him at his child's school. We went to the charity boards he sat on and asked a simple, devastating question in private. Would you keep funding the things you love if you knew how they'd been paid for? The question cost him a seat and a client. The ripple was immediate. His firm reassigned him, donors balked, and for the first time a man who made comfortable lives for others felt the heat of exposure that opened doors. Once you make one middleman uncomfortable, the others watch and try to protect themselves. That's when people start making errors. They delay transfers. They insist on paperwork. They call lawyers who recommend things lawyers can't actually deliver. And the more they double down on legal buffers, the more brittle their private options become. We started timing small releases, emails, invoices, backdated receipts to coordinates of annual meetings, donor luncheons, any event that would force conversation into daylight. Daylight is costly for men who learn to move undercover, but daylight has limits. Lawyers count on time and complexity, and they're very good at burying things in terms no one else reads. So we added another instrument, social friction. Subtle, targeted outreach to donors' circles, careful conversations with civic leaders, and small, whispered narratives in neighborhoods enough to make the comfortable association awkward. Reputation has a market value. When you make donation hauls feel like risky purchases, money moves. They retaliated by getting quieter and more surgical. The efforts against us became less about spectacle and more about removal. Marcus's ex-firm quietly fired a handful of junior staffers with the kind of paperwork that read like restructuring. The courier we'd filmed had his bank accounts frozen and his driver's license audited for administrative inconsistencies. The net tightened around people who could not afford to defend themselves. That cost me. I stopped answering the phone when certain numbers came up because the callers were often the ones who handed me the people I needed to protect. It was in that fog that I decided to cut a new way. You can't only attack systems. You have to create a counter system that moves in the space between their resources, something nimble, not beholden to donors or law, and capable of being brutal but not indiscriminate. We called it a safe channel, encrypted, staffed by volunteers who'd been hurt, and directed at 3 goals: collect, protect, push. Collect concrete proof in places our earlier probes had missed. Protect those whose lives had been touched. Push the narrative into venues where money had to answer for meaning. The safe channel produced the things. 1. A bank of small, painful confessions from people below the real decision-makers. 2. A new exposure plan that mapped where donors and trustees could not hide behind law without losing something they actually cared about. The first helped us build human testimony that regulators respect. The second made our next strike surgical. Our strike was not dramatic. It didn't involve burning servers or shattering glass. It was the sort of move that turns a donor's calendar into a liability. We leaked a set of supporting documents not as a torrent, but as a drip to a donor network that included university boards, museum committees, and a couple of foundations known to cut ties quickly. The documents were undeniable: routing memos, stamped receipts, and coordinator emails with a pattern that matched the worldly language of stabilization. We made the leak feel confidential and catastrophic. One by one, donors called for internal reviews. Board members asked for a halt on a handful of initiatives. The public effect was small headlines and, more importantly, immediate cash flow interruptions for the network. It worked because it targeted a currency they valued more than money: continuity. Men in those rooms fear disruption of programs they've built more than prosecutors because their entire narrative legacy, plaques, named wings, depends on it. It forced trustees into a position where they had to choose between complicity and accountability. Some chose accountability publicly. A few chose to protect quietly. Either way, the machine stuttered, but the cost of every success tightened the screw on the people closest to me. Claire became furtive in a different way, not hiding meetings, but refusing to leave the house without checking twice. We argued in low voices about whether we could continue if we won anything. Would it be worth the lives at stake? I had no noble answer. There was only arithmetic. The ledger balanced in ways that felt obscene. For every name I exposed, someone paid a price. Sometimes it was a career, sometimes a small project that would have fed dozens of families. The moral calculus hollowed me out. I started waking up with the taste of ash in my mouth. The loom, always patient, began to pull its own tricks. They built narratives of us being vigilantes, reckless men who took the law into their hands. They flooded legal channels with complaints. They paid PR firms to fashion stories about destabilization. They hired investigators to follow Danvers, to call his sources, and threaten libel suits. The thing they understood better than I had was that institutions can outlast fury. Law is slow and expensive, and not everyone has the stamina to stay in the fight. So we adapted again.